Thank you very much. Thanks for turning out at an ungodly hour on Monday. Just a word on this, Charles. Is it arrows up or arrows down?
Arrows down.
Arrows down. Okay, right. I'm a bit of a technophobe, unfortunately. Well, I think we've chosen quite a propitious moment to have this discussion. I hope it will be a discussion, and do feel free. I mean, the questions at the end, but do feel free to interrupt if you think something isn't clear or is just plain wrong. And let's try and get a sort of dialogue going as soon as possible. The reason why I think it's propitious is it's a year after the election victory of Muhammadu Buhari and the All Progressives Congress. And that was a landmark, I think, for many reasons. I mean, first of all, it was the great triumph of the outgoing head of the Electoral Commission, Atiru Jega, for organising an election everybody said was impossible to organise, and in the time he did it, and in terms of the credibility of the election. So there was, I think, this time last year, I was there in Abuja with a range of people, politicians on both sides of the divide, the average person, the average voter, and then the whole sort of diplomatic circus. You had sort of top officials from Washington and London and Paris all conniving, and what's going to happen if Jonathan doesn't hand over, what's going to happen if they dispute the result, and people were making the direst prophecies, the trope, this will make Bosnia look like a tea party and all the rest of it. And then in the space of 2 days, everything changed. The leaders of Nigerian business and the faith organizations sat down with Jonathan and said it'd be a really good idea to phone up Buhari, even before the result comes out, and say, well done. And he did that. And it was an incredible turning point, I think, in the country that this transition was handled, because there were a lot of people around Jonathan who had no intention of handing over and were going to do precisely the opposite, and had all sorts of clever game plans to dispute the result and to cut off the oil in the delta. And so it was, the first step was great, and Buhari again was pretty dignified in the way that he dealt with it. And I think probably hats off to Jega, who there was a lot of provocation. People were trying to have him arrested for countermanding their recommendations, and all. These are people around the ruling group, and he bore it all with an element of high element of dignity. So far, so good. Buhari came in, and again, I think the important thing about what happened a year ago was not just that, sure, there was a block vote from the northwest, and there was slightly less of a block vote from the northeast. There's no denying that. So that's why Buhari was chosen, and that's why he won a stunning victory. So, let's not kid ourselves about that. But the other important thing he'd done was to win a lot of people's sympathies in the southwest, which he'd failed to do in previous elections. And that was really, really important. And a lot of people were going before the election. I sat down with one of Jonathan's closest aides, and he said, Lagosians will never vote for Buhari. As far as they're concerned, he's an extremist, he's from the northwest, he's just coming in to, grab the power and take it back to the north. And, there's no confidence in them, in him at all in the southwest. And I said, well, what about all the people around the party from the southwest, people like Tinubu, people like Kayode Fayemi and Babatunde Fashola? And he said, they'll be swept aside. Don't think twice about that. The fact is that a year later, that coalition, that national coalition, has come under strain, but it's still there. And I mean, I think that's the core to the political legitimacy of the All Progressives Congress government so far. But at the same time, I think we've got to be really honest about the situation at the moment. The economic crisis is terribly bad news for Buhari. There's no doubt about this. It's a rather obvious thing to say. But initially, people were saying, well, crashing oil prices, it's a bit of a two-edged sword. yes, it means declining revenues, but it also means the opportunity to make reforms and to tell people this is how bad it's got and we've got to change. And the big issue in Nigeria, and it's been the big issue for 30 years, indeed since Buhari first came to power as a military leader in 1983, is how to wean the country off the dependence of oil and really develop the non-oil sectors, agriculture, services. And if you look at, we're going to see a diagram later, if you look at the structure of the gross domestic product in Nigeria, sure, agriculture and services are taking a much higher percentage of the income. But you are talking about a country of 180 million people around about, and you're talking about lifting most of those people out of pretty dire circumstances, measured in terms of dollar income per day, i.e. less than, these crude World Bank statistics. I know they don't tell anything like the real story, but just as a measure of the money to go around, there's a lot of work to do to develop the non-oil sectors. And so the question now is, is Buhari going to be able to use this current economic downturn to really make the reforms and sell them to the wider public? And I think in terms of his personality, there's no question about it. The thing that's really helped him, particularly in the South, he's a tough guy. He's ex-military and disciplined and anti-corrupt and strongly anti-corruption. And it's not just rhetoric. It's not just a campaign slogan. In his case, his personal case, we can talk about the rest of the government, but his personal case, he's made his assets declaration. And I think those of us who've known him for a long time think that if he was going to go and steal a couple of billion and build a palace in Dubai or Mayfair or wherever, we'd have seen it by now. He certainly doesn't live like that. He's not that kind of guy. Unfortunately, those great moral qualities don't automatically make this a winning government, and we can talk about the pressures on him now. But to start off with, we've got that sort of trio of economic headaches, which landed really on his desk as soon as he was sworn in the end of last May. Falling commodity prices, well, that's oil and everything else that Nigeria produces. Tighter economic international financial conditions, and that's Nigeria's access to lending. And at the moment, because of the debt deal done a decade ago under the Obasanjo government, Nigeria is, as the international financial community like to say when they're looking for business, it's underborrowed. The problem is, one man's underborrowing is another man or woman's good housekeeping. And is it wise in a situation when you've got declining revenues then to go around the world and start borrowing heavily? And that's a big argument going on in the country at the moment. And certainly the cost of borrowing is going to be a lot more expensive right now after the end of the US quantitative easing. Then the third headache he had was the slowdown and rebalancing of China's economy. And you can see from that IMF graph there on capital inflows, just everything is shrinking, and see how much it's shrunk. By 2012, the country had reached a kind of peak after the Western slowdown in 2008. It fully recovered, and money was sluicing in. I have to say that most of the money sluicing into Nigeria was energy sector related. Not nearly enough of it was manufacturing, productive investment, and that's one of the Buhari's big gripes with investors, both local and foreign. But that high point in 2012, that was tended to be oil and gas related investment, although there was more investment going to power, which is definitely a positive, and less investment going into manufacturing industry, the sorts of things that Buhari wants to build up. And you can see that by 2014, it was precipitate. So as we're having the election, the capital inflows were falling off a cliff. So the next slide. So 2 weeks ago, Buhari took 10 ministers off to Beijing to talk Turkey or probably glazed duck with the Chinese leadership. Now, you might say that's a strange destination given the Chinese slowdown. I think these things are relative. Everyone bangs on about the importance of China in Africa. You've got to compare the total Chinese investment in Africa is just about the pegging level with the Chinese investment in Venezuela. So put in that perspective, historically it's been very much tied to resources, it's been very much tied to access to essential commodities, minerals that Africa has and China needs. I think part of the China rebalancing program is very much an effort to not only rebalance its own economy, but to broaden its presence in places like Africa. So you've and what the sorts of dialogue the Beijing authorities are having with countries such as Nigeria, South Africa, and Ethiopia is not just about how much is your oil going to cost, but it's about what Chinese companies can we get into your country to open up factories. Our own labor costs are too high, certainly in the seaboard. We want to come and make things in Africa with joint Chinese African outfits and sell into the African market. It hasn't escaped the notice of the authorities in Beijing that there's 1.2 billion people in Africa, and as the owner of Clark Shoes used to say, that's 2.4 billion feet to make shoes for. So that's they see the market, and there's a new determination to go in there. So there's out of that, there's the $6 billion, and it's not clear so far just how much of this money is new. The Nigerian ministers said most of it is. What the $6 billion for the infrastructure projects is going to be old-fashioned tied money. It's not aid. We're talking about money that's going to be made available at commercial rates. Then the increase in the amount of Nigerian foreign reserves is currently 10%. That's going to go up. Again, they haven't given an exact figure, but I've heard figures as high as 20%. So that's a substantive switch away from the dollar. The third element is also very interesting, is this deal with the ICBC to extend the use of yuan in Nigerian trade finance arrangements. That's essentially saying, what on earth is the point of China trading with Nigeria and going for US dollar? We should be trading direct in the renminbi. Well, if those of you familiar with what France does in the Francophone countries in Western Central Africa, they use the currency as a political device and a financial device. It gives them influence, and it locks in a certain section of trade. In France's case, quite a substantial section of trade. It's clearly the model for what China is trying to do in Nigeria. But it's going to be very interesting what the pushback and what the negotiating position on the Nigerian side is. The critical thing is we haven't seen an announcement about the exchange rate. There's a story that it's going to be about 30 naira to the yuan. And those of you who are good at these things will see immediately if you cross into the dollar and the dollar-yuan rates and compare those, and the current Nigeria naira dollar rate is 200 nairas, official rate 200 nairas to the US dollar. Sure, the parallel rate is about 300, 350 nairas to the US dollar. The 30 naira to the China yuan rate is a substantial devaluation. So it's an interesting development. It means that Chinese trade with Nigeria will be extra competitive because it's going to be on a devalued rate. we're going to have to watch that rate very closely. Fourth point is the so-called panda bond. Again, the argument there is that, you Westerners, you're pricing yourselves out of the market. We're a big country. If you want to rate us with Venezuela, for example, or Myanmar, or whatever, it's up to you. But we're going to go to the Chinese and get a better rate. So that's, again, it's a signal from the authorities in Abuja. Yeah, we'll deal with China on a like-for-like basis, on a commercial basis. And last point, and I think it's a signal for Buhari, what Buhari wants to go with the country. Got people like Dangote, but Dangote's by no means the only one with lots of money around, and he's cut a deal with the Chinese to fund cement plants, not in Nigeria, actually, in the rest of Africa. The important thing about Dangote as an individual is he has certainly a product of the whole patronage system. He's done very well, played hardball with Obasanjo in the 2000s, got his block on his ban on competitive cement companies, got his monopoly within Nigeria, and now he's turned Nigeria into a cement exporting country, and he's building cement plants right across Africa and in Eastern Europe, and giving France's Lafarge a run for their money there. So he and is very shrewd in terms of his international partnerships, and this one with China is obviously, you've got the capital, you've got the equipment. Let's work together. I've got the political access and the cred. So I think that's an important partnership, purely private sector. Oh, the other thing that Dangote is doing, we might get onto it later, is building this big refinery close to Lagos now, and that's what is the most ambitious refinery, I think, in Africa and the Middle East. The targeted production level is 650,000 barrels, and it's not just a domestic market he's looking for, because actually that's in excess. You've got 450,000 from the state-owned refineries. That's way in excess of what Nigeria's consuming. But it would be able to supply the entire regional market, which, again, a lot of Nigerians would say that's something that the country should have done 30, 40 years ago. Why are they buying petroleum products from Europe and the Middle East when they should be refining and processing, distributing them within the region? And I think on that refinery project, again, I think one's got to take it very seriously. The money is there. He's put his personal money in. He's got bank loans from Standard Chartered. He's going to float it on the markets. And it makes a lot of sense as an integrated project. Okay, I've talked us through that. The growth in trade. I think that last point's pretty important. Initially, the big demand is financial. They need the money into the system because it's not enough money circulating. I mean, the crash in oil prices has really pushed the economy, almost to a halt, and bringing that trade and the possibility of inflows of capital into the economy at this time it's got to be a very good thing. But as I said, the issue is the terms of trade, and we haven't seen enough detail on that. That's a look at some of the challenges facing the government. I think it's Nigeria's biggest budget to date. It's pushing 30 billion, slightly bigger than the last Goodluck Jonathan budget. The important thing about it is the oil price has fallen by 40% since Goodluck Jonathan's heydays. So almost a third of that budget has to be raised through borrowing. So there's a very substantial budget deficit. And as you can see, both the Nigerian statistics people and the IMF are looking at suppressed growth, say an average of 2.3, 2.4% this year. The IMF are saying could be some respite next year, but the It depends very, very much on the price of oil, which is remaining stubbornly low for all sorts of reasons at the moment. This is to give you a sense, this is again from the IMF, to give you a sense of just what's been happening in the economy. So you've got the oil price going down, production going down, foreign exchange receipts going down, and that's affecting the government directly on oil revenue, capital investment. So the overall deficit goes up, and the payments arrears, that's payments arrears to local contractors, very important in terms of the dynamism of the local economy, and foreign contractors, as some of you may know. Then it also affects the private sector, the companies. Sales go down, profit margins go down, investment goes down, and debt goes up. I mean, questionable debt, shall we say. And then for the government, the political importance of that both those pressures on the government and on the companies, the business sector, then pressures the households. Governments wants to cut has cut the subsidies because the price has fallen down, but there's a big debate about whether that can be sustained if the price goes back up. Households are having to consume less. They've got less money to spend on health and education. And those services, those public sector services that the government have been providing are under pressure. And those more middle-class families, households that are paying for private healthcare, private schooling, are struggling to meet those payments. Then on the banking sector, corporate lending is down, sovereign lending is up, and as we've said, we've seen the Chinese lending as an example of that. There's other lending, Kuwait, Qatar, maybe World Bank, well, certainly World Bank, we don't know about the IMF, but also the non-performing lending. And also there's concerns about various practices within the banking sector. If we could call them the unreformed parts of the banking sector after the previous bank governor, Lamido Sanusi, had his big purge of dodgy banks and margin lending and all the rest of it. People say that some of those practices after he left crept back in the system. And so the central bank governor, Mr. Emefiele is going to have a tough time. He's got a man under huge pressure at the moment. The other graphs there shows the contribution to Nigeria's growth, and you can see there the way that oil has fallen off so sharply, and manufacturing too. Which is very oil-related and import-dependent manufacturing, because so many of the inputs for Nigeria's manufacturing companies have to be imported. And then the other sectors is what's really keeping it going. That's the services and the agriculture. And then you see, again, the third graph, the current account balance. You see, again, oil trade balance almost falling off the cliff, current account balance going down, and then the non-oil current account going up, strengthening a bit. Again, that's the domestic services, huge boost in communications. Even the film industry, Nollywood, is becoming more and more important. Cultural power, soft power, and agriculture, which is just, I think, hopefully on the brink of some sort of revolution in Nigeria. So what was pretty clear after the swearing in last year was the government was facing this economic crisis, but Buhari is very loath to appoint ministers. And then there was a sort of an interregnum between then and November. Finally came up with a team which... a lot of people were a little sort of underwhelmed by the team. It didn't have the sort of the international stars that some people had wanted. But in fact, actually, the economic team, the personnel, are pretty good. I don't think anyone who knows the country, and I've spoken with many of the bankers in Lagos, they say they've got no issues. Certainly, I mean, Enelama was the guy who's a now trade and industry investment minister. He was the guy who built up he's the biggest private equity company in Nigeria over 15, 20 years, highly regarded, and one of those examples of a guy who really delivers. So I think he's going to be a very important guy on the kind of economic diplomacy. He was in Beijing last week. Previous month he was in Washington talking to the Americans. What he's trying to do is to work with the government and the private sector to find out what can be fixed in terms of the bureaucracy of the economy. And there's this big chart the World Bank do every year as a research project doing business in the world. And he wants to, he's told us that he wants to bring Nigeria 50 places up the chart in a matter of years. Kagame's done the same thing in Rwanda. Part of it is smoke and mirrors. If you know what to do and you know the areas you can make the quickest bureaucratic changes, you can do them and push it up the chart. But I think the message from Enelama is, it's not just oil and gas. Come in, and there's a real push to bring in people who are going to process commodities, process raw materials, and work outside of the oil and gas sector, and also work with the new power companies as well, and all the service industries around them. So that's his position. The finance minister, Kemi Adieson, was formerly with the Ogun State government in the same position, finance commissioner. She's got experience of banking here and I believe in the States. She has held her own in the, perhaps I could say, chauvinist world of international banking. She was in Washington last week. Babatunde Fashola was the former governor of Lagos State. Very impressive character. He's got a delivery record. It's pretty substantial if you've visited Lagos before him and after him. The doubt there is that he's got the portfolio from hell, energy, housing, and works. Public works is one of the most politically contested portfolios. It's where all the loofah is. Any public works minister is going to face every day he comes into the office a long line of people looking for contracts. And whether there's any money in the kitty or not, that long line is going to be there. My brother said that you had fixed this, and where's my contract? And that is one of the harsh realities, and he's dealing with that in a time of declining government revenues. Housing again. Under Jonathan, the housing market was moving. The former finance minister, Konjo Iweala, was talking about building up the housing market, much more mortgage lending and so on. And now with the current financial strictures, there's going to be a bit of a slowdown on that. There's also a pressure for much more public housing or public-backed housing. Again, it's a lack of revenues. With 180 million people, half of whom are living in urban, peri-urban environments, housing is, a big political issue for the government, and it's hard to see where the money is going to come from. But it should be a big job-creating issue as well. So it's getting the money and the jobs and the demand all working in tandem, which is probably enough for one minister who's working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then the last thing, which is really the thing that's going to test Fashola, is the electricity privatization that comes under the energy. And with the best will in the world, this has been going on now, 2016. It's been going for 16 years, effectively, and it's still not delivering. That much is clear from the shutdown, the electricity shutdowns we're seeing. But we're now to the stage the companies have been privatized, but the networks haven't, and there are real questions about how some of those contracts for the privatized companies were awarded and why those people came in when they came in. And what are their qualifications, apart from having a lot of money in their bank accounts to run electricity companies and produce electricity at a tariff that is relevant, that is doable for the average Nigerian citizen. So big questions about the power sector, unfortunately. And as we all know, without fixing that, nothing else gets fixed in the longer term, particularly the push to economic diversification and trying to rebalance Nigeria's economy. The other guy who's right in the middle of the storm is Godwin Emefiele, the central bank governor. And a very interesting fellow. He kind of started out, he had the kind of demeanor of a bank manager from Surbiton. And he was very self-effacing, very sort of bank managerish. And he replaced the very flamboyant and very impressive, charismatic Sanusi. And everyone said, this guy is not going to cut it. He sort of locked himself. He survived a year into the Buhari government. No one thought he gave him a month. And he has now become actually one of the strongest promoters of the anti-devaluation position. Why he's doing that is another question, but he's actually read the tea leaves and he's politically in line with his bosses, which is probably, despite constitutionally the bank is independent, and someone like Sanusi made the most of that constitutional provision. Emefiele is kind of like held his opponents at bay with this promoting of the opposition to devaluing the naira. The last point was one of the things I think even the government will agree with its critics is they haven't been very good at coming out and saying this is the situation we face, this is the mess we're in, but this is what we're going to do about it. So can you just give us a break? Give us 6 months, a year, things are going to get better. And this is what we're doing. We've got total transparency. We're not like the old government. You're really going to see what we're doing with diminishing resources. Unfortunately, that hasn't worked. We're beginning to see the signs of a little bit of a lager within the government and a reluctance of people, not necessarily the ministers, but some of the people around the ministers, the people that journalists have to deal with, the PR officers and all the rest. Give us a break. We'll talk to you when we need to. And there's a feeling amongst people that the government's got to do more to explain. There's still sympathy, but the sympathy, I think you've got to see that the sympathy is declining as the economic conditions get tougher. I've talked about the evaluation. Now, this whole argument about devaluation, it's weirdly political. It sounds like a very technical, boring issue, but it's weirdly political. For Buhari, it goes right back to, again, the 1980s, when there was a similar situation. He came into run a government in an era of crashing oil prices, and the IMF said, well, good, you've come in. The last government was really corrupt, and, the civilians under Shigari. You come in, you clean up, but you've got to devalue the naira. We've got to have trade liberalization. Got to privatize, the state industries, and it'll be great. The economy will run away. Buhari said, no, I'm not doing that. Well, I know once I start messing around with the exchange rate, the naira is going to be worthless within 5 years or less. We're going to have massive inflation, and I'm going to be thrown out in a coup d'etat. Paradoxically, he didn't devalue, but he was thrown out in a coup d'etat because his opponents, as they are now, and I have to say this, it's where it gets very political. The opponents are gathering together to kind of undermine the government and to say this government, too tough, too nasty, unmovable on the big economic issues. They're not going to last the distance. And you can see the undercurrents of that. It's a bit of a rerun of it was last time. We're in a different era. I don't think we're going to get, the dawn broadcast from Abuja barracks at 6 a.m. But you can see that the opponents of his economic strategy, which the opponents would call it sort of knee-jerk economic nationalism. We won't devalue the naira. It is based on a very acute reading of the politics. the first thing that would happen if the Naira, if you just said, right, let it fall, okay, let the Naira go down to 300, 350 to the dollar, the first thing that would happen would be the price of fuel would double immediately. And if the price of fuel doubles, then everything that's moved by using vehicles that buy that fuel is going to go up proportionately. He would have hyperinflation within weeks and months. So getting from where things are at the moment, where propping up an exchange rate, which is clearly out of kilter to what would pertain on the parallel, what is pertaining on the parallel market, to a situation where a more flexible exchange rate is going to be very difficult. There have been a number of discussions, and his position so far, and he repeated it again at the weekend, is he remains to be convinced. He's not saying, right, under no circumstances. And I mean, no sensible head of government or finance minister ever says, I think devaluation is a good idea, but not just yet. I mean, they're always going, when they do it, they're always going to try to build up. So I don't think some form of exchange rate flexibility, as the economists call it, is out of the question at all. But effectively, what you've got at the moment are two rates. You've got a rate. Those people lucky enough to get the foreign exchange at the 200 nairas to the dollar rate are laughing literally all the way to the bank, and those who can't are sourcing, at about 300 or more. The problem is that anything like an administered rate in Nigeria, you've got who's getting access to that administrative rate and why. And it's not just the people whose use of foreign exchange, as Buhari would call it, is productive and contributing to the wider sort of development of the economy. It's a lot of traders who've got political connections, unfortunately. And I mean, that's the problem. Whenever you get that sort of officially managed exchange rate, you're going to build in, I think, the potential for patronage and profiteering. Next one. Okay, so we're still on the situation. The other guy who's really in the eye of the storm at the moment is Kachuku, the guy who's MD of the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, and he is Deputy Oil Minister. Whatever you think of the man, he was lead counsel for ExxonMobil. He's a pretty cerebral guy by ExxonMobil's opinion. And he's also quite brave because in the sense that there's just no way out for him. If there's anything going wrong with the oil industry, it's his fault. Whether it's oil earnings, the price of oil, and current crisis he's facing is the availability of gasoline in the market, gasoline and diesel in the market. And he's reacted somewhat irritably. He's said, "What do you think I am, a magician or something? We've got a falling oil price and all the rest." So one of the things they're doing is of interest to oil companies is they're trying to cut deals with the oil company about financing fresh imports. So we're looking in the short term about emergency measures. Buhari is absolutely determined to get the four local refineries working effectively, but they're still doing less than 20% of demand. The Dangote refinery will take another at least 2 years to come on stream. So you're looking at 6 months of emergency measures. Maybe the refineries producing more of the local gasoline or gasoline for the local market, but another 2 years down the line before Dangote's shiny new refinery kicks off. The Kachuku is talking about, again, and this is a perennial in politics in the country, restructuring of the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, talking about, first of all, a name change. It's going to be the NPC instead of the NNPC. And he is very keen, as are quite a few of the kind of new generation of oil entrepreneurs in Nigeria, to get the government to do what Saudi Arabia has just started doing with Aramco and selling off chunks of the crown jewels. There's a lot of, again, Buhari's generation of leaders in Nigeria I think that's a bit of a red line for them. But again, if they can be persuaded that the money could be channeled into productive investment elsewhere in strengthening the links between the oil and gas sector with the rest of the economy, they might just buy it. But that's definitely where Kachuku wants to go, and again, that generation of entrepreneurs wants to try and find a way to sell down some of the equity that the government has in the oil industry and use that equity for other development. So that's important. The politically sensitive issue, immediate political sensitive, there are a lot of politically sensitive issues in the reform of the NNPC, is the omission of the Petroleum Host Community Fund, which is this fund in the Delta, which is pretty radical, actually. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure Venezuela's got it, and a few other countries have it. But what they're arguing is that then all the oil companies, state and private, operating in the country, out of their net profit, 10% of their net profit has to be reinvested back into the local communities in which they operate in the oil-producing economies. And that's become a kind of an article of faith of the Niger Delta militants. Let's see. And they're saying that Kachuku, who actually comes from the Delta, said, look, I mean, it's not in the first bill, but it's going to be in the second bill. Well, we'll see. You know, it's if it is left off, I think there's going to be more energy in there's already quite a bit of energy in it. The campaign in the Delta about getting more resources into the Delta at the moment. We've seen the emergency measures, the huge arguments about the money, which are going on and on, not least in some of the law courts here. Essentially, it's what the NNPC has been transferring over the last, however many years to government or to the Federation account in the central bank. And again, there's a big dispute between the current management, not the Good Luck Jonathan management, but the current management of the NNPC about some of these claims. And have been a succession of auditing reports from PricewaterhouseCoopers and the rest of them on trying to understand just who owes what to whom and why it wasn't paid. There was a $1.2 billion deal with Chevron last year. At the moment, the view in the market seems to be that there's a reluctance to get involved, do more fundraising, of that kind of level until we're certain about what the new rules are. As I said, the former oil minister, Diazani Alison Mundeke, is currently embroiled in legal proceedings here, and that refers to as much as $24 billion in the oil swap deals. Again, whether they were mismanaged, again, whether they were simply opaque, and whether there was a real conspiracy. That's one of the elements of the legal case. Auditor General has already said that in 2014, the NNPC failed to remit $25 billion to the Federation account. That follows on from the former central bank governor Sanusi's claims that between January 2012 and June 2013, a further $20 billion was not remitted. So that explains, very quickly, the power behind Buhari's anti-corruption campaign. I mean, massive amounts have gone missing. So you just look at those two arguments and those two claims. I mean, that's each one of them is almost the annual budgets. So this is not a small matter by any means. Oops, sorry. Oops. Okay, right. It's this one. So there are a new set of deals, and they are coming under. This is mainly for lifting, and also for importation of petroleum products. And they are coming under more scrutiny. Certainly, the President's office and so forth is much more on the case than before, and the fewer front companies are marketing NNPC crude. Kachuku has said that he wants to replace these crude oil swaps and offshore processing agreements. The strategic alliances, which were much criticized, he said he's not going to replace, and he's actually renewed one of them. So there's an issue about those. I mean, those of you in the business know the arguments for and against. I mean, my sense of it as a total amateur on these things is that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the strategic partnerships, but the way they were set up and the lack of transparency and accountability, definitely, it was possible to take advantage of the NNPC hugely, and that's exactly what happened. Maybe with the complicity of some people within the NNPC. Those are 5 contracts in which those who watch the oil industry say Matrix, Northwest, Eterna, MO, and Shorelink, expressing surprise, shall we say, that those people have got contracts to bring in fuel. Okay, we've got a fuel emergency, but some of those people, and some certainly their companies, had been involved in the fuel subsidy scandal. And that, if you remember, that scandal blew up in the wake of the last government's attempts to end the fuel subsidy. And initially they wanted to wipe it out completely. They were pushed back into a compromise position. They said, okay, we'll cut it by 50%. And then, the campaigners said, well, the point is that the reason why it's costing you so much money is that it's so corrupt and the wrong people are getting the subsidies. And so that's actually opened up a process which was pretty remarkable, because all the fuel importing companies were then called to give evidence to the National Assembly and the National Assembly's special committee on this publicly, and it was televised. And it became like a kind of, oil industry soap opera in Nigeria. So, so-and-so would come on and sort of duck and dive and try and explain how he got this contract and how much oil he'd delivered, but there were real doubts about the value for money he'd given. And some of them just sort of more or less sort of hands up, yeah, it was a rip-off. But so that was quite a bright moment. So I think it does show you the capacity to run a much more accountable, open system. As I said, but those are the names that are circulating around. And people saying, well, why is he giving contracts to them? Doubtless they will try to defend themselves in the coming days and weeks. So the anti-corruption campaign, regarded as Buhari's most successful policy, I think, and it's the one that they've done quite a lot of local polling in the last few months, ready for the sort of, first-year assessments. And the view is that, yes, personally, he's still got credibility, and most of his ministers have, but their attempt to sort of clean out the civil service and clean out all the commission agents that are part of the kind of patron-client system has not worked. But then, in all realism, it was never going to after a year. The president can be totally honest and totally hardworking, and his 20 ministers, his 40 ministers can be all of the same disposition. You're not going to get that sort of ethical revolution on the ground in the system within a year. The question is, how much have they actually achieved? And I think that's what people are looking at. Where has the graft been squeezed out? And the money that they're collecting, and there's still hundreds of millions of dollars stolen by the Abuja administration, turning up in Switzerland, in America, in London, in France, still finding its way back to Nigeria. The question is, how is that money being brought back into the system, under what rules and regulations, and how accountable is that process going to be? So the other question, the counter claims on the anti-corruption campaign, is that these guys, well, Buhari, we all know about Buhari. He was a military dictator in the 80s, and he's just persecuting his opponents. I just don't buy that. I think he's shown quite a lot of restraint. I mean, for example, the former National Security Advisor was one of the 4 guys who came to arrest Buhari in the coup d'etat in 1985. And they gave Dasuki quite a lot of rope to hang himself with. I mean, there was no major, Buhari gets sworn in on the 31st of May, it wasn't a case of waking up the next morning, arrest Dasuki. And there's nothing like that. The first thing was, let's work out, we spent $6 billion a year for 5 years on defense, and we have an army of 130,000 soldiers, we have an air force of whatever, 30,000 airmen. How come a militia of 5,000 men has occupied, at least one state, 24, 25 local government areas, and is talking about marching on Abuja and is blowing up whatever it likes, where it likes? How does that work? And everyone said, there's something deeply wrong, deeply corrupt here. It's, the parallel is Iraq, for those of you who have, where you saw what had happened there. Except the military budget in Iraq was like 3 times the size of the military budget in Nigeria, but it had the same effect. You had a national army that was demoralized, was being ripped off, and an officer class that were all becoming millionaires. It's one story I should tell you, anecdote, but absolutely take it seriously. Came from the governor of Kaduna State, and one of his relatives said, late one night, he was a major, not a senior, middle-ranking officer, major. One of his bunch of officers came to him one night and said, want to give you $1 million. And he said, what do you mean you want to give me $1 million? We want to give you $1 million because you wouldn't believe how much money we're making with this Boko Haram thing. And we just feel that you're going to be a bit resentful if you don't see part of it. So we just want you to take the $1 million and do what you like with it. You don't need to say, you don't say where it came from. And there were many stories like that. You're looking at 4 to 5 years of $6 billion of defense, certainly not going, situations where the infantry were not being paid, let alone, buying weapon systems for good value and all the rest of it. So there are a lot of questions. So when Buhari came in, the first thing he did, said, with Monguno, his national security advisor, let's investigate what happened to the last 5 years of $6 billion a year funding and all these arms procurement schemes. And it makes the South African agonies over $6 billion look pretty small by comparison. Because what they found is there's been massive misappropriation of funds. A lot of bad equipment, dodgy helicopters, dodgy guns had been bought. They weren't getting value for money, and that much is clear. So as part of that investigation, and run by the Army's own senior officers, people who really knew what they were talking about, with some fairly credible investigating police and judges and so on involved, they indicted Dasuki. And it was sometime after that. Dasuki said, fine, I'm in the country, I'm not running away, I've got nothing to hide. And then the figures started coming out, and then they started playing hardball. Then his lawyers started trying to get bail for him. Well, a lot of people would say, yeah, that seems fair enough. If you're charged, you should have bail too. The feeling is that what these guys are trying to do is just to stretch out these cases indefinitely. And as they say, justice delayed, justice denied. And what the Buhari people want to do is to have them done as over, the money comes back, we find out what happened, and then we fix the situation in the procurement for once and for all. So there's a real test of on the human rights front, on the judicial system. Just a sort of small example again of what's going on in some of the cases. There's an assets declaration case against the current president of the Senate, Bukola Saraki. Now he's up there accused of making false declarations of his assets and so on, for which can be tried in a special tribunal because, again, it sort of goes against the entire ethos of having accountable politicians. By the way, David Cameron bangs on about publishing his tax accounts. You can't compete for office in Nigeria unless you have tax accounts. I'm not saying that they're necessarily 100% accurate, but it's part of the culture that you have to show tax accounts. Apparently, the allegation is that Saraki tax accounts were a little bit, shall we say, optimistic, given that he and his wife have got about $1 billion worth of property assets in Lagos alone. But he's defending himself. He found a Lagos High Court judge who said that his entire process should be abandoned. It was unfair. it also, then the investigators looked at the bank account and the tax statements of that Lagos High Court judge and found out the guy's salary was like, or his personal net worth was 10 times what he would have earned in the last 10 years. So he thought, well, maybe that judge is not just being a judge. Maybe he's got into business. And that gives you an example of the tensions. They're faced with dealing with rampant fee-taking within the judicial establishment and the claims of human rights. But the human rights of the elite, we have to say, we're not talking about the guys arrested for not using the footbridge on the Corridor Expressway. We're talking about the elite. So it's a tussle that's going to go on. But I mean, these cases are very, very important for the government's, bona fides. So much of it remains unresolved. All that's sort of obvious. But I'd say, as I said earlier, I mean, I don't think it's a conspiracy theory. There is a patronage network in the country. There's a patronage network in this country, a patronage network in every country. But the thing is, in Nigeria, that network is absolutely expert at circumventing any attempts to regulate it. And it's always, 5 moves ahead of the government. And what's going on at the moment is people are doing that balance. It's the guys who were bringing in generators, bringing in diesel, and found out it was highly profitable to have a dysfunctional state electricity company because it was so much more profitable to have diesel generators, for the small domestic ones, for the big industrial ones. And they have had to make their peace with the idea of having a functioning electricity network that is privatized. So, those calculations are going on, but it's quite clear that they started with the government, the Buhari government, on the back foot. They said, wow, this government could be serious about corruption. And now I think they're fighting back. I'm not saying by any means, don't get me wrong, that anyone who opposes a government's exchange rate is part of that sort of corrupt network. There's a range of opinion in the country, but there's certainly people who are saying, right, I'm just going to put the squeeze on these people. I can't make the sort of money I want from business in Nigeria at the moment, so I'm just going to put the squeeze on them. And that's, added to the economic slowdown. The question is, it's not just enough to recognize that. The government's got to have an answer to it, that is not an iron fist answer. It's got to be, carrying the people with it. And I fear at the moment that it's not really carrying the people with it on this issue. Just saying again the obvious, that the APC, they won't accept that they're a coalition, but essentially they're a historical coalition, 3 or 4 different parties coming together, and the row over Bukola Saraki's presidency of the Senate just shows you that it's still pretty fragile. And those same patronage networks that are kind of like slowing down the business in Lagos, they're also, making alliances with the politicians, saying, well, if you guys came across from the APC, back to the PDP, and many of those APC politicians, governors, and assembly members were from the PDP in the beginning, we could really oppose these guys. We could do essentially what the Republicans did to Obama, in 2008 onwards. Just block everything he does, and that is part of one of the political scenarios. That no matter how much Buhari tries to do with his ministers, if he doesn't win the political battle within the National Assembly, there's going to be paralysis. We know where that leads. We have the petroleum industry bill is now sort of in its 8th or 10th year. They could still sort of stop all that stuff in its tracks. And so, that quote is actually from one of his advisors, and it simply, sums up how he sees things, which is really quite sort of mechanistically. He said, we've just got to pass these laws, brief the ministers and enforce them. The problem is that the interface between the presidency, the chief of staff, the secretary to the federal government, and the assembly members is just not healthy. It's not effective and functioning. And they've got to get that. And there's, to be honest, there's a sort of contempt, I think. The people around the presidency don't think much of partisan politicians. The Nigerian National Assembly doesn't have a great record in terms of productivity. It has a great record in terms of emoluments. I think they're about among the highest paid senators and representatives in the world. They're certainly pegging level with US senators and reps. More sort of ranting on about the patron class and their acolytes. Power struggle between the elites. Yeah, that's where we're headed. Buhari. So, just historically, he is the last of that generation of nationalist post-Civil War independence leaders. And it's interesting that he's come in and I think he does feel that history very strongly. He's the guy who's got to stabilize the economy and hand it over to a new generation of leaders if the country's polity is not going to be destabilized by military intervention and everything else. And this is the sort of slightly more optimistic ending. Long-term outlook strong. It's the population, obviously, and those agricultural programs are not just going to cut import bills, which are ruinously high and ruinously unnecessary, the $5 billion at least on rice and sugar, but create jobs and create more development, houses, and finance the social sector and the social sector reforms that have to be financed. And the possibility that if Fashola succeeds of a more reliable power sector is going to be revolutionary. But people have been saying that for 15 years. And that's it. Just one point, Africa Confidential comes out every fortnight, but it's all the time. It's on a website, africa-confidential.com. Do go there. There's lots of free stuff, but I would encourage you to take out a subscription. I would encourage you simply by a market incentive. Anyone who comes to this meeting today will get 15% off a yearly subscription of Africa Confidential. Just we're going to send you emails and just sort of say that you attended the session today and you get 15% off. And you can phone up anytime. We can discuss these issues. Last thing, we're organising, if your interests extend to Zimbabwe, we're organising a conference on July the 5th on the new Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is just about to cut a debt rescheduling deal with the IMF and World Bank, and EU is going to cancel sanctions of Zimbabwe. So it is going to be a really interesting conference. We've got the finance minister and the central bank governor coming to London. Exclusive conference, 9 o'clock, July the 5th. I hope to see you there.